The world believed D-Day was won by guns and guts, but it began with whispers, lies floating through the air. In the summer of 1944, inside the cliffs beneath Dover Castle, a handful of men and women prepared to fight Hitler with nothing but radio static and imagination. Their job wasn't to shoot bullets, it was to build ghosts. Every key they tapped, every coded burst they sent into the night, stitched together the illusion of an entire army that didn't exist. A fake army, so convincing that Hitler himself would refuse to move his tanks while real Allied soldiers bled in Normandy. The mission was called Operation Fortitude South, and it was the most dangerous bluff of the century. British intelligence needed the Germans to believe the invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. To sell that lie, they built a phantom force, the first U.S. Army group, supposedly commanded by the fiery and unpredictable General George S. Patton. Rubber tanks filled fields, wooden aircraft glistened under false sunlight, dummy landing craft bobbed on quiet harbors. But the soul of the operation wasn't in any of that. It was in a basement filled with humming transmitters and exhausted operators, people who would never fire a shot, but would change the course of the war. Among them was Lieutenant Graham Ellison, a former radio engineer who'd once built jazz transmitters in London clubs before the war. Now, he built ghosts. Alongside him, cryptic-minded Sergeant Ada Monroe translated real war chaos into elegant lies. "We're the world's first army of imagination," she joked, though her hands trembled whenever she touched the Morse key. Each night, the operators forged conversations between fake battalions, fake supply units, fake medics, sending them into the air for German ears. From the enemy's perspective, it was flawless. The call signs matched known regiments. The timing matched troop drills. Even the accents inserted in brief voice transmissions were recorded from real soldiers that didn't exist on any map.
By late spring, the airwaves over England were alive with fiction. German intercept units in France were ecstatic. They were certain the Allies were massing thousands of men for an assault on Calais. In Berlin, the High Command's confidence grew so strong that Hitler ordered his panzer divisions to stay put in the north. He was waiting for Patton. He was waiting for the army that Ellison and Monroe were inventing one keystroke at a time. Every night, Dover's tunnels vibrated with a low hum. Static hissed like rain as messages leapt from transmitter to transmitter. To anyone listening outside, it was ordinary military noise, but every pulse was a thread in the world's greatest lie. The operators worked under brutal secrecy. No names, no units, no recognition. They couldn't tell their families what they were doing. Some believed they were testing radio prototypes. Others thought it was weather research. Only Ellison and a handful of command officers knew the truth. They were fabricating the rhythm of an army. They built entire divisions out of thin air. The 14th Armored Battalion, the 3rd Infantry Supply Corps, entire companies that never existed except in their code books. Even supply manifests were sent to fake depots that had no warehouses. British intelligence made sure physical evidence backed the broadcasts. Truck convoys rolling at night with empty trailers, soldiers marching back and forth across open fields to fool reconnaissance aircraft. Everything was synced with the radio chatter. One slip, one repeated phrase or mistimed transmission, and the Germans would smell the lie.
Sometimes, exhaustion nearly broke them. Ada's hands bled from typing. Ellison's voice cracked from endless encrypted drills. But they knew what was at stake. Across the channel, in Normandy's choppy waters, tens of thousands of real soldiers were preparing to storm the beaches. Their survival depended on this radio play. On June 5th, the night before D-Day, the fake network buzzed with manic precision. Supplies confirmed for the Calais assault. one signal declared. Another, Patton requests confirmation for fuel convoys. German interceptors logged it all, convinced the main blow was still coming. When dawn broke on June 6th, German coastal commanders watched the Normandy landings and smiled grimly. A diversion, they said. The real invasion, they thought, was yet to come at Calais. Hitler agreed. His order? Hold the panzers. Don't move. The lie had worked. While Allied troops fought and died on Omaha, the strongest German armor sat idle, waiting for an army that existed only in the hum of a radio. The lie was so perfect, it started to breathe on its own. Inside the tunnels, the operators no longer imagined they were pretending. They began believing in the ghost they'd built. They could visualize entire divisions marching, see the glow of fake campfires, hear the metallic clang of trucks that weren't there. Graham Ellison sometimes caught himself saluting officers who didn't exist. The weight of the illusion pressed on everyone. For Ada Munro, it wasn't just about deception anymore. It was about survival. If our signal drops, men die in Normandy. That truth kept them awake through endless shifts, fingers blistered, eyes red from the glow of the dials. Meanwhile, across the channel, German intelligence analysts worked feverishly, decoding each transmission that Ellison's team released. One particular officer, Major Kurt Eberhardt, became obsessed. He'd been tracking Allied frequencies for months and was convinced that Calais was the true invasion point. He mapped out the fake army's every movement, piecing together a puzzle that didn't exist. Berlin rewarded him with praise and reinforcements. In a bitter twist of fate, the better Ellison's lies became, the higher Eberhardt climbed. The Germans even adjusted their artillery placements, fortifying Calais and pouring thousands of tons of concrete into bunkers that would never be used.
By mid-June, as Normandy erupted in chaos, the deception had turned psychological. Allied intelligence fed Eberhardt's curiosity like oxygen to a flame. Each night, Garbo, the famous double agent, reported that Calais remained the main threat, and Ellison's radios confirmed it. Two lies from two different sources, harmonizing like a symphony of deceit. The German war machine swallowed it whole. When British bombers struck Calais in late June, it sealed the illusion. Hitler grew certain the Allies were softening defenses before the real invasion. Normandy is a distraction, he declared. And so he waited and waited as the Allies pushed deeper inland, unopposed by the full German might that still sat idle near Calais. Inside Dover Castle, exhaustion turned to disbelief. They were just voices on a radio, yet their phantom army had fooled one of history's most ruthless regimes. But victory brought guilt. Ada's journal from that night captured it best. We lie for the truth, but the cost is still ours to carry. They had saved lives, tens of thousands, but at the price of knowing those on the other side believed their fiction so completely that they built their strategy around it. The fake army had become more real than flesh and blood. The longer the deception lasted, the more dangerous it became. German reconnaissance planes continued flying over Kent, searching for signs of the 1st U.S. Army Group. The Allies responded with theater-worthy staging. Inflatable tanks gleamed under the morning sun. Canvas trucks rolled out just as cameras appeared overhead. Soldiers from nearby camps were ordered to march in circles to mimic fresh reinforcements. To anyone looking down from the sky, southeast England looked like a hornet's nest of invasion. But there was still the risk of discovery. One stray photograph of an empty field,
One captured operative who knew too much, and the entire illusion would collapse.
To maintain control, British intelligence tightened secrecy to suffocating levels. Ellison's team now lived underground entirely. No contact with the outside world, no letters, no daylight. They became ghosts themselves, mirroring the army they'd invented. Ada began hearing phantom Morse clicks even when her equipment was off. "It's in my head," she murmured, "the sound of our own lies." Yet there was no room for breakdown. The deception had to continue until the Germans shifted their reserves, until Allied command declared the ruse complete. Weeks passed. Normandy advanced. Hitler's generals argued over where to deploy their divisions, but his paranoia, stoked by the fake radio traffic, froze them in place. By July, Allied troops had broken out of Normandy, racing across France. The war had turned, and still, from beneath Dover's cliffs, Ellison's team transmitted ghost orders, feeding the illusion that Patton's massive army was ready to strike Calais any day. Even when the Germans began retreating, Hitler refused to believe. He demanded his commanders prepare for the second invasion. The deception had done more than mislead him, it had shaped his reality. Inside Dover's tunnels, the final broadcast went out on August 15th, a coded message confirming Phase 2 readiness. There was no Phase 2, no more ghosts to raise, just silence.
When Ellison finally stepped outside after nearly 3 months underground, the dawn over the channel looked unreal. "We built a storm out of air," he said quietly. The operators packed up their transmitters, leaving behind walls scratched with code numbers, dates, and fragments of Morse. Somewhere across the water, German officers still stared at their intercept logs, convinced they were reading the pulse of a phantom army that had already disappeared. As France began to crumble beneath the Allied advance, Berlin still clung to the fantasy of Calais. Even as radio silence from the supposed First U.S. Army Group stretched into weeks, Hitler refused to let it die. His intelligence reports were full of phantom coordinates, courtesy of months of fake chatter. He convinced himself that Patton was merely biding his time for a second invasion. That delusion paralyzed him. Panzer divisions that could have crushed the Allied breakout at Falaise stayed idle, waiting for an attack that would never come. Every delay bled Germany's strength further.
In Dover, Lieutenant Graham Ellison stared at the quiet radios. The transmitters that once hummed like living things now sat cold and still. The silence was both victory and void. "We ended a war with whispers," he muttered, half to himself. Ada Monroe, gaunt from exhaustion, smiled faintly. "Whispers louder than bombs," she said. But she knew the cost. Belay had eaten away at them, their nerves, their sense of reality. It had all blurred into the static. None of them would ever be the same. A few weeks later, British High Command called for a final debrief. The operators were ordered never to speak of their mission again. Officially, the fake radio network had never existed. Their work was buried under layers of classification, the operators scattered to other units or sent home without recognition. But the effect of their deception rippled across Europe. German resistance crumbled faster than anyone predicted. The psychological toll on Hitler's generals was immense. They distrusted their own intelligence systems, doubted their spies, and turned on one another in chaos. One German field marshal would later admit, "The enemy's radio ghosts broke our faith in logic itself." In the underground war rooms, Ellison packed up the last code books. He paused over the final page, hundreds of fake call signs, every one representing a soldier who had never lived. He thought about the real men who had died in Normandy,
men who'd been saved by a lie powerful enough to reshape the truth. We didn't win by fighting. We won by pretending. When he walked out of Dover Castle that night, the sea air felt foreign. Above the cliffs, the stars flickered faintly, silent, honest, and real in a world built on deception.
Months later, as Paris was liberated and Allied columns thundered eastward, the story of the Phantom Army began to spread in hushed tones through intelligence circles. No one outside the highest command truly understood how vast the deception had been. To the public, D-Day was a triumph of courage. To those few who knew, it was also a masterpiece of illusion. Behind every victory headline, there was the unseen hand of those who had fought with lies instead of bullets. In London, senior officers toasted Operation Fortitude as one of the greatest strategic manipulations in military history. But the radio operators who'd made it possible were never invited to the celebrations. Graham Ellison found himself stationed briefly in Antwerp before being quietly discharged. He wandered the docks at night, watching ships sail home under blackout lights. Sometimes he'd hear the faint hiss of static in the distance, phantom echoes from the past. For him, the war had never really ended. It just faded into silence. Ada Munro, meanwhile, joined a small intelligence bureau working on post-war communications. When asked what she'd done during the war, she only smiled and said, "I built something that never existed." Her superiors never asked further. Across the ruins of Europe, the Germans slowly realized they'd been chasing ghosts. Captured radio intercept logs revealed thousands of hours of fake Allied transmissions, carefully structured and mathematically perfect. When Major Eberhardt, the German analyst who had championed the Calais invasion theory, saw the truth, he refused to believe it. "Impossible," he said, staring at the transcripts. "No one could create an army out of nothing." But they had, and that disbelief was proof of how well the deception had worked. In 1945, as Hitler's empire collapsed and the war neared its end, Allied archives locked away the records of Operation Fortitude. History would remember the beaches, the battles, the blood. Few would remember the voices in the tunnels, the people who fought their war in whispers and shadows. Yet every soldier who survived Normandy owed a silent debt to them. They were the invisible soldiers, the ones who lied to save the truth. For decades, the world knew only fragments of what truly happened beneath Dover Castle. Official accounts credited Operation Fortitude as a clever feint, but left out the human ghosts behind the static. Not until the 1970s, when British archives finally opened, did the story begin to surface. Historians discovered logs filled with thousands of phantom transmissions, entire battle formations crafted out of empty air. The revelations stunned even veterans. Newspapers called it the army that never was. But for the few who had lived it, the headlines felt hollow. They knew the deception wasn't a headline, it was a haunting. Graham Ellison, then an old man with trembling hands, read those articles with quiet disbelief. His grandchildren thought he'd been a simple radio operator. Now he watched the world piece together his invisible war. "They'll never know the weight of silence," he said softly to Ada Munro when they reunited after 30 years. She had become a teacher, her voice gentle, her hands still scarred from years of tapping keys. Together, they walked along the white cliffs overlooking the channel. The same sea that once hid their transmissions now shimmered peacefully, unaware of the ghosts it had carried.
Ada remembered every sound, the click of Morse, the hum of circuits, the faint echo of lies that saved lives. "Do you ever think we went too far?" she asked. Ellison hesitated. "If the truth saves no one, then it isn't worth telling," he replied. They both knew that their deception had rewritten history, but it had also rewritten them. The line between truth and delusion had blurred forever. Somewhere deep inside, the hum of the fake radio still lived on, a ghost signal repeating endlessly, a reminder that in war, even lies can be heroic. By the late 20th century, Operation Fortitude was taught in war colleges as a masterclass in strategic deception. Documentaries showed maps, fake tanks, and rubber aircraft, but rarely mentioned the human exhaustion behind the illusion. Intelligence officers praised it as the operation that shortened the war. Historians debated its moral line. Could truth ever justify deceit? But for Ellison and Monroe, it wasn't philosophy, it was memory. They carried it in their bones. When the Dover tunnels were opened to the public decades later, tourists wandered through the dim corridors, unaware that they were walking through a battlefield made of silence. On one wall, restoration teams found faint carvings, names, dates, and radio frequencies, etched by exhausted hands. One sequence of dots and dashes translated to a single word: freedom. No one knew who had written it, but those who understood Morse knew its rhythm matched Ada's old signature. She had left it there, perhaps as a confession or a farewell. Ellison died quietly a year later. His final words recorded by a nurse who didn't know his story: "Keep the signal going." In a way, it never stopped. Every historian who uncovered the files, every storyteller who brought the tale to light, became part of that signal. The fake radio that convinced Hitler an army existed had become something greater, a symbol of the invisible courage that hides behind victory. Long after the war, when the world finally realized how close deception had come to saving civilization, one truth remained unshakable. Sometimes, the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet or a tank, it's belief. And the greatest victory of all was won not by armies of men, but by a handful of ghosts whispering into the dark. The Cold War dawned on the ashes of Europe, and yet the spirit of Dover's deception lived on, quietly pulsing through every wire, every covert plan that came after. Nations studied the Ghost Army and saw the future of warfare. If the Allies could win a continent with fake radios, what else could be done with illusion? From Moscow to Washington, new generations of spy masters learned that the mind was a battlefield far deadlier than any front line. Propaganda, misinformation, and psychological warfare all were born from that single echo in the cliffs of Dover. What began as a desperate lie to protect D-Day had evolved into an entire doctrine of power. But for those who had lived the deception, glory meant nothing. Ada Monroe refused every interview request. She believed the story should stay buried, that too many would misunderstand it. "They'll call it trickery," she wrote in one letter never sent, but it was mercy, disguised as deceit. She had seen what belief could do, how a handful of signals could sway nations, alter maps, and bend reality itself. For her, the lesson wasn't about victory, it was about fragility. Humanity's faith, she realized, was the most dangerous weapon ever created. Years later, as technology advanced, historians replayed surviving recordings of the fake transmissions. They described the static as eerie, almost human. Each pulse carried not just a code, but emotion, fear, exhaustion, defiance. In one fragment, a faint female voice can be heard reading weather data that never existed. Some believe it was Ada herself, her words still looping through the ether after half a century. That haunting signal became known among enthusiasts as the Ghost of Fortitude. Whether myth or memory, it proved that even in silence, the deception still spoke. It whispered through history, reminding those who listened that sometimes the truth is too dangerous to be trusted alone. Today, the story of the fake radio that fooled Hitler stands as one of the strangest miracles of World War II. No bullets, no tanks, no fleets, just faith, illusion, and flawless precision. Modern intelligence agencies still cite it as the operation that defined psychological warfare. Yet, beyond strategy and glory lies something deeper, a moral wound that never healed. The people who lived in those tunnels knew they had touched the edge of godlike power, the ability to create belief from nothing. And with it came guilt, because once you've seen how easily the human mind can be guided, you never see truth the same way again.
The tunnels under Dover Castle are silent now. Visitors hear only echoes, the faint hum of restored generators, the drip of old pipes. But if you stand long enough, you can almost imagine the ghost army waking again. The clatter of keys, the whispers of coded lies, the heartbeat of history written in radio waves. You can feel the tension of men and women who changed the world without leaving their seats. They didn't wear medals or march in parades, yet their invisible war saved millions. As the world races toward new wars of information and deception, the lesson of fortitude grows sharper. Power isn't just in the weapons we build, it's in the stories we make others believe. In 1944, a handful of dreamers used that truth to outwit an empire. They proved that the mind is the most dangerous battlefield of all. And though time has buried their names beneath history's roar, their signal still drifts somewhere in the static, quiet, patient, eternal. The war they fought in silence will never truly end, because belief itself never dies.